I'm joined by DePaul University history professor Thomas Mockaitis. His book, Conventional and Unconventional War, will be published a little bit later on this year. Now, several studies have found that Belgium has the highest number of jihadists relative to its population than any other European country. And I was told earlier today from an expert there in Brussels, there's about 1,000 people on watch lists. Why is that, do you think?
Well, it's got one of the highest concentrations of Muslims in Europe. It's about 7% of the population of 11 million. Only France is roughly in the same ballpark. But it's not; those are not the significant figures. It's the concentration of Muslims, a variety of backgrounds, North African, Middle Eastern, and so on, essentially in ghettos. 25% of Brussels is Muslim. Now, 99.9% of those people would not engage in any kind of violence. But the conditions in those areas, 50% in some cases unemployment. And the other is that these areas are almost not exactly no-go areas for the police, but there's not a particularly strong presence there. There's a lot of what we call double alienation. People, young men in particular, who don't identify with their parents' world and yet aren't really accepted into mainstream European youth culture, and also suffer from, the high unemployment and the disadvantages of being a discriminated against minority.
Well, getting back to your description of the areas that they live in, that works as kind of a cocoon for them in many ways, because these people don't have much of a trust or a relationship with police, right?
Absolutely. A number of interviewees asked me after the Brussels bombings, or actually after the arrest of the last Paris suspect, well, why would he go back to Molenbeek? Why would he go back to his old neighborhood? I said, well, the best place to hide a tree is in a forest. He had cover there. He had people who would be willing to shelter and protect and provide for him. And, it worked fairly well.
Tom, let's talk a little bit about the investigation. Authorities being scrutinized after information came out that Salah Abdeslam was only questioned for 1 hour between the time of his capture and the terror attacks last week, and none of the questions were about imminent terror threats. Now, Belgian police releasing a man who they arrested on suspicion of being involved in the attacks. Turns out they didn't have enough evidence to hold him. How are you viewing this investigation thus far?
Well, I have a strong suspicion that when they say they didn't have enough evidence, they may have realized that he wasn't involved. I don't know that. But usually you can find a reason to continue to detain an individual if you're pretty confident they were involved. Most of these countries do have emergency regulations, legislation, and so on that allows for, some period of detention without a charge. But apparently, all we can do is speculate. But it seems that this individual may, in fact, be innocent. We just don't know.
Well, there have been a lot of charges that the system in Brussels and Belgium, it's too bureaucratic. And then there's also this complaint about the other war at work in Brussels, of course, which is the Flemish-French divide. I have a friend who was in Brussels the day of the attack. He said it was just disarray as people were coming out of the metro station. They didn't have the tape up, and there were arguments going on. Do you think the jihadists know this? They're exploiting that?
Well, what you're talking about is, interagency cooperation, which is not as easy to do as people realize. We don't have perfect interoperability between, say, Cook County law enforcement and Chicago. They've got 9 police forces that have various degrees of jurisdiction in parts of Brussels. That is problematic. It's probably too many. On the other hand, it's easy to armchair quarterback these things after the fact. A catastrophic incident of this kind is, not easy to manage. I mean, London has had more experience of this sort of thing probably than any city in the world. And in July of 2005, they did some things wrong as well. Doesn't mean that the Belgians couldn't have done a better job, but I'm a little more sympathetic to them given what they had to deal with.
Professor Thomas Mockaitis joining us from Chicago. Thanks so much.
Happy to do it.